Hey guys, it's Miss Vinian. I'm here to do a flip video for you on Reconstruction. You want to go ahead and get the dates on that. Reconstruction starts in 1866 all the way to 1877. So you will need to have your learning target sheet out, and so that you know that these are the essential questions we're going over. So you should be taking Cornell notes, and if you forgot your template at home, then just use a regular sheet of paper. The essential questions that we're going to be looking at is what impact did the Civil War leave on America, and you're also discussing how did the end of Reconstruction change the laws and daily practices of the nation, particularly those in Tennessee. So this is the way the flip video works. You can watch the PowerPoint screen. Sometimes I'll pull up videos, and I'll always try to show you my face so that you know that it's me. And so yeah, all right. These are our learning targets. We're actually probably going to get to 1.5, explain the changing status of African Americans in America from 1876 to the early 1900s, before we get to the Hayes-Tilden presidential election. So we'll just flip-flop those. Okay? All right, so let's begin. Reconstruction begins as soon as the Civil War is over, and Ranger Lewis showed us what happened at the end of the Civil War. And so what we call is Reconstruction, putting the country back together. So this is the period during this is the time where the U.S. is trying to rebuild after the Civil War. You have the Old South, which is slavery and antebellum period, and then you have the New South, which is trying to rebuild itself after all these battles and having all their slaves freed. This also refers to this process that the federal government used to readmit defeated Confederate states to the Union. And we will go over that directly in class, so you may want to leave a little spot right here so that you can write about that. So to get back into the Union, before you could get back in the Union, states had to basically readmit themselves, and there are several things that they had to do beforehand. But before they readmitted themselves, they were divided up into military districts because they'd been taken over by the Union because the South had lost, and these states were not ready to join the Union again. So they were placed in military districts, and you can see that each district had a general from the Union, and the only state that did not have a military district was Tennessee, because Tennessee joined the Union back first, like we talked about in class. Okay, and then also during this time you have the passing of the 13th Amendment, which was that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall have been duly convicted, is allowed anywhere in the United States. So this would essentially free the slaves. However, when we get to talking about the freeing of the slaves, you're talking about this whole population of people who are now free. They don't know where to go. They have no place to go. They're divided from their families. They don't know how to live unless they're being told what to do. They can't get jobs. They have to compete for jobs with white people, and you're living in this very racist society, so it's going to be very difficult to be successful. So in the South, to kind of keep the upper hand, the black codes were passed in southern states, and these were put on newfound freedom. They limited the newfound freedoms of African Americans. Okay, it forced them to work on farms or as servants. They prevented African Americans from owning guns, holding public meetings, working in certain places. There's all these different laws. One specific black code was it's saying that any freedmen over the age of 18 years old that is found assembling themselves together in the day or night, and any white person assembling themselves as free men, or living in adultery or fornication, will be convicted. And actually, if you check this primary source out, it says that the white person will be convicted more than the black person. This is promoting slavery within the society. Okay, so one other thing that they did, and we had talked about with Ranger Lewis, the 15th Amendment, where African Americans were given the right to vote. Laws were passed to keep blacks from voting. What they would do is they would have a poll tax, and basically that's you had to pay a tax to be able to vote. And many of the freed slaves didn't have money to pay to vote, therefore they're not able to vote. The other thing is they said that only people who voted, like their grandfathers voted, only those people could vote, and that's called the grandfather clause. That eliminates African Americans because, of course, their grandfathers didn't vote. They were slaves.
Ms. Jones, could you please go to the South office? Ms. Jones,
sorry, let me go back. So this is meant to keep African Americans from voting, which keeps African Americans from being voted into the government to make legislative changes for freed black people. So this is a way that in this racist society in the South kept African Americans down and kept them at a subclass, okay? So even though Civil War is over, this Reconstruction period, you see tons of just tons of racism and tons of people trying to keep the society that they've always known. Okay, and this picture kind of shows that, like, African Americans walking from limited citizenship to being full citizenship to full citizens, which we will see in the 14th Amendment. So in Congress, what's going on is that the Congress is very radical, and they are for African Americans getting their rights. The difference is that after Abraham Lincoln gets shot, Andrew Johnson takes over, and we've talked a little bit about Andrew Johnson, and he's from the South. So he was very easy on the South, and he let them come up with these black codes. But the Congress, Republican Congress, they called them the Radical Republicans, wanted the South to change before they got admitted back to the Union, which is why there's military districts. Okay, so you have the president and Congress kind of battling over this this problem because the South is still acting like before the Civil War. Okay, and this picture kind of shows radical Republicans, the Congress, being on the side of African Americans and the right to vote. Okay, because you have to remember back then, the states have a lot of rights themselves, so they can pass laws, but it has to be taken to the Supreme Court before it can be knocked down. So the 14th Amendment comes out during this time. It guarantees citizenship to all people born or naturalized within the U.S., except for Indians. And remember, Indians are mainly out west at this point on reservations, and even though we have this problem of racism that they're trying to heal, they still are racist toward Indians. Okay, so while you have one thing that's hopefully going to get better, you still have another thing that's still terrible. And then basically it says that state governments cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. Okay, so 14th Amendment. All right, so what happens with Johnson and the Radical Republicans? They're going head to head. Congress is angry at President Johnson because he's not going along with their Reconstruction policies and even Lincoln's Reconstruction policies, and he's Lincoln's VP. Okay, so as a result, they impeach him. What is impeachment? It's the process of charging a public official with a crime. So what happens is they have a trial with the president in the Senate, and they find him guilty or not guilty. By one vote, the Republicans failed to convict Johnson, so he won, and he wasn't actually impeached. The only other time another president was impeached was Bill Clinton, and if you don't know why, you can Google that. Okay, and we'll talk about it later. So some things going on in Tennessee. You have the yellow fever, and this goes with your learning target about Reconstruction in Tennessee. You have the yellow fever in Memphis in 1878. This yellow fever spread from slave ships before the Civil War, and it starts in Vicksburg, so Mississippi. So lady in Memphis, one lady dies, and she flees. The whole town flees. Okay, so she comes from Vicksburg, and she dies, and then it causes 20,000 people. So this is just an example of an epidemic in this time. This is a yellow fever house, residence of W.J.L. Holland, who gave his quarters in his life during the yellow fever epidemic. So he was there to help those, and if you had yellow fever, you had to go to a certain house and be isolated and quarantined. And there's a picture of that. Okay, so during this time is the rise of the KKK, or the creation of the KKK. So we want to look at this as the first round of the creation of the KKK. So this KKK is a secret society, Ku Klux Klan, opposed to African Americans obtaining civil rights, particularly the right to vote. They used violence and intimidation to frame blacks. They wore white robes and they wore hoods, and they did this so that it could hide their identity, so people wouldn't know who they are. So this is 1866. When we talk about the 1920s, they won't cover their faces much. They won't hide their identities. The KKK is known for murdering so many people, and there's so many unsolved murders during this time. So really what they would do is try to intimidate blacks by lynching some, and just by trying to scare some from going to the polls or working at a place where they hadn't worked before. This is a picture of the KKK near Burning Cross, and what they would do with this Burning Cross is they would burn it near a house of someone they were trying to intimidate. Okay, and that leads us into the 15th Amendment. In 1870, the 15th Amendment finally became law. So this gives African American men the right to vote. Now, there will still be literacy tests, poll taxes, and the grandfather clause in some states, but this is going to say, like, nationwide, African American men should get the right to vote. However, this is going to make women mad because women have been trying to get the right to vote, and this does not give women the right to vote. Women is going to be another 50 years before you get the right to vote, and we will cover that in class as well. Okay, so, and that, if you want to look at that, that will be a question. The 19th Amendment will give women the right to vote. Okay, so in Tennessee, 14 African Americans were voted immediately, and they were all former slaves. So this is awesome, but the problem is that after 1877, there is not another African American that is elected until 1950, and that is because of reasons like the literacy test, the poll tax, the grandfather clause, the KKK. All of these things would keep African Americans from the poll. Therefore, no African Americans would get elected because white people weren't voting for black people. Here's a picture of the first African American senators and representatives in the Congress. Looking sharp. Alright, so that brings us to segregation and Jim Crow. So starting in 1881, this kind of leads in from the black codes. Blacks had to stay in separate hotels, they sit in separate parts of theaters, ride in separate rail cars, and have separate schools, libraries, and parks. We know this as segregation. And segregation is when it is legal, it's a legal separation of blacks and whites in public places. And Jim Crow laws are laws that enforce segregation. So when you see pictures that are like whites only, blacks only, those would be Jim Crow laws, okay, that enforce segregation. Rosa Parks having to sit on the back side of the bus, on the back part of the bus, that would be Jim Crow law. Jim Crow laws are going to start in 1881, and they kind of come out of the black codes, and they're going to go all the way up to the 60s until the modern civil rights movement, okay? So one of the reasons why Jim Crow and segregation happens is because the Supreme Court rules that segregation is legal in the court case Plessy v. Ferguson. You better write this down because Plessy v. Ferguson is one of the most important cases in American history. The only one more important would be Brown v. Board, which overturns Plessy v. Ferguson. In this court case, they say segregation is fair as long as it's equal, separate but equal facilities. So they're saying it's fair as long as African Americans get the same facilities. But we all know that that is not what happened, and it ended up being separate and unequal. Okay, it takes until 1965, almost 100 years after the Civil War ends, for Jim Crow laws to be outlawed and blacks to finally realize legal equality in America. So 100 years. And then that brings us to sharecropping, which is how lots of freed slaves got work after the war. So what we have here is called sharecropping, and this is what it looks like. If you follow this right here, first of all, if you got into sharecropping, you would go to a merchant, okay? Loan tools and seed up to 60% interest to the tenant farmer. The tenant farmer is the recently freed slave to plant the spring crop, okay? The farmer also secures food, clothing, and other necessities on credit from the merchant. Okay, so they're loaning tools to the farmer, they're giving them food and clothing on credit, and the merchant holds a lien, which is like a mortgage on part of the tenant's future crops, so that he will repay. So then the tenant farmer, after he's borrowed all this, plants crops, harvests in autumn, and then he has to turn over half of his crop to the landowner, and then he has to give the remainder of his crop to the debt that he has accrued from borrowing and for food. So what does that leave the sharecropper with? It leaves him with nothing, and this is basically slavery all over again. He's not getting paid. Okay, so that's going to wrap up for today what we're talking about. So we start with free slaves all the way to having voting people in, all the way to black codes, Jim Crow laws, sharecropping. So African Americans are in this cycle of just being entrapped. Okay, and it's basically slavery all over again for them. And so we'll continue this on our next video or in class. But basically, I want you to finish your left side and your summary, and make sure you answer that essential question. and bring that into class on whatever day I see you next, Friday or Monday, and you'll have a good night. See you later. Bye.